I'm a mobile mechanic. I fix engines because metal doesn't judge you, and I've spent 10 years drifting between dying farms where the silence is heavier than the work. When Kate called about a seized tractor that hadn't run since her husband died, I figured it was just another rusted machine. But the moment I pulled into the yard, her twin 6-year-old girls stared at me from the barn doorway like they'd been expecting someone specific. I was under the chassis when I heard one whisper to the other, "He's going to make Mama smile again." That tractor was hiding something far darker than neglect. I'd never met Kate before that call, just her voice on the phone, tired and thin, like she'd forgotten what hope sounded like. Her husband died 3 years ago in a rollover on the back 40. Everyone said it was a tragic accident, that he was a careful man who hit a soft patch of ground. But in a small farming community, a widow carries more than grief. She carries whispers, guilt, and the weight of every unanswered question. Kate hadn't smiled since they lowered him into the frozen earth. Now her twin girls were telling each other I could fix what was broken in their mother. And the deeper I dug into that tractor, the more I realized the real cause of death had been hiding in plain sight, rusting in her barn, waiting for someone to finally look close enough. I pulled into the farm just as the morning fog was burning off the lower field. The place had good bones, but the neglect was visible from the road. Fence posts leaning, a row of equipment sheds with peeling red paint, and a rusted windmill that hadn't turned in years. Kate stepped onto the porch before I killed the engine. She was tall and thin, late 30s maybe, with dark hair pulled back in a messy knot that looked like it had been done in a hurry and not redone since. Her eyes had that hollow look you see in people who have learned to survive on very little sleep and even less hope. She didn't say much at first, just pointed toward the big barn at the edge of the property and said, "It's inside. Hasn't moved since the day he died." Her voice was flat, like she'd rehearsed these words so many times they'd lost their sharp edges. I followed her through the barn doors and saw the tractor sitting in the shadows. It was an old workhorse, a 1982 Massey Ferguson, the kind built to outlast its owner. But this one had been parked for 3 years and the tires were half sunk into the dirt floor. The metal was corroded in places, but I could tell the core was still solid. What stopped me in my tracks wasn't the machine. It was the two little girls standing perfectly still at the back of the barn, hand in hand, identical blue eyes fixed on me like I'd just walked into a story they'd already heard. Macy and June, 6 years old, same freckled noses, same crooked pigtails, but one of them had a small scar above her left eyebrow that marked the difference. Kate introduced them quietly. "That's Macy with the scar. She fell off the porch step when she was 3. June never leaves her side." The girls didn't smile, didn't wave. They just watched me with a seriousness that felt decades beyond their age. Kate told me to let her know if I needed anything and then disappeared toward the house, leaving me alone with the tractor and her daughters. I knelt by the engine compartment and started my initial inspection. The fuel lines were dry-rotted, the battery was dead as stone, and the oil had turned to sludge. But those were surface problems. My hands moved automatically over the metal, reading it the way a doctor reads a patient. That's when I heard the whisper, "He's going to make Mama smile again." I turned my head and saw the girls had moved closer, maybe 10 feet away now, still holding hands. The one without the scar, June, had spoken. Macy nodded like she was confirming a prophecy. I didn't know what to say in that moment. I just stared at them and felt a strange chill travel down my spine. Kids that age don't talk like that unless something has planted the idea deep in their heads. Someone had told them a story about me, or someone had told them to wait. I finished my assessment and went to find Kate. She was in the kitchen, standing at the sink with her back to me, shoulders tense. On the counter next to her was a framed photograph of a man in his early 40s with a kind face and a farmer's tan. David, the husband. I told her I'd need a few days to get the tractor running. She nodded without turning around and said, "Take whatever time you need. Nothing been right around here since he left us." That night I stayed in a small guest room above the barn. Kate had offered the main house, but I preferred to be close to the machine. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those girls and the way they looked at me. So I did what I always do when my mind won't shut off. I researched. I pulled up old news articles on my phone about David's death. The official report from the county sheriff's office called it a single-vehicle agricultural accident. David was disking the east field when the tractor rolled on a moderate slope. He was thrown from the seat and crushed beneath the rear wheel. No witnesses. The investigation concluded the ground gave way after heavy rain. Case closed. But the local paper had published a letter from a neighbor, an old man named Walter Green, who questioned the findings. He claimed David was the most cautious operator he'd ever known, that he never took that slope without lowering his speed and engaging the differential lock. Walter wrote that the tractor had been acting strange the week before the accident, pulling to the left, something David had mentioned to him at the feed store. The letter ended with a line that no one in the county wanted to hear. Something on that machine gave way that should never have broken. Walter died of a stroke 8 months later. No follow-up was ever published. I put down my phone and stared at the ceiling. The next morning I went back to the tractor with fresh eyes. I jacked up the front end, pulled the wheels, and started examining every joint in the steering assembly. It took me 4 hours of cleaning away grease and rust before I found it, a hairline crack in the steering knuckle, running from the upper bearing surface down toward the tie rod mount. It was almost invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. But I know what metal fatigue looks like. I've seen it on a dozen different machines brought to me too late. This wasn't wear and tear. This was a manufacturing defect, a flaw cast into the steel when the part was poured, waiting for years under the surface until one day, under just the right stress, it would snap. The steering knuckle is what connects the wheel to the axle and allows you to turn. If it fails at speed on a slope, you lose all control instantly. The wheel folds under the chassis, the tractor lurches sideways, and no amount of experience can save you. David didn't hit a soft patch of ground. The ground gave out beneath him because his front wheel collapsed without warning. He never stood a chance. I sat back on the dirt floor and looked at that cracked piece of metal, my hands shaking. Then I heard small footsteps. Macy and June had crept into the barn again, standing at the edge of the work light. June tilted her head and whispered, "Did you find the bad thing?" I asked her how she knew there was a bad thing. Macy answered this time, her voice barely audible. "Because Mama says Daddy didn't make a mistake. The tractor was broken before," he told her. I closed my eyes. David had known something was wrong. He told Kate, and she had carried that knowledge for 3 years, probably wondering if it was her fault for not forcing him to get it fixed. But what if David had tried to get it fixed? What if he'd contacted someone about the defect and was ignored? I stood up, dusted off my jeans, and walked toward the kitchen with the cracked knuckle wrapped in an old rag. When Kate saw my face, she froze. I set the metal on the table in front of her and explained what it was. Her expression crumbled first, years of guilt dissolving into raw shock. Then her eyes sharpened with something I hadn't expected: recognition. "He called the dealership the morning before it happened," she said, her voice trembling. "He told me they said he was imagining things, that those models were bulletproof. I heard him on the phone, Matthew. I heard him beg them to send someone to look." She covered her mouth with both hands as the realization hit her fully. They knew. They told him to keep running it. That silence in the kitchen felt absolute, like the whole farm was holding its breath. And then Kate said the words that flipped everything from tragic to sinister. I still have the voicemail he left on my phone that morning. He said, "If anything happens to me, make sure they check the steering. Promise me." I never listened to it again after he died. I was too afraid. She pulled out her phone and with shaking fingers navigated to an old message from the cloud backup. David's voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable. "Kate, I'm heading out to the east field. The tractor, still pulling left, and the dealer says I'm overreacting. But just in case, I want you to know, if something goes wrong, it's not your fault. And don't let them scrap the machine until someone who knows what they're doing looks at the steering knuckle. Promise me." The voicemail ended. Kate was crying now, ugly, heaving sobs that shook her whole body. And the twin girls, who had followed me inside without a sound, climbed onto the bench next to their mother and wrapped their small arms around her. June looked up at me, eyes wet but steady, and said, "Now you have to help us make the people who lied tell the truth." I nodded, knowing this was no longer a repair job. This was an investigation into a defect that had been covered up, a man who had predicted his own death, and a company that had let him climb onto that tractor anyway. The twins weren't just hopping I'd fix their mother's smile. They were waiting for someone to finally finish what their father had started. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the cot in the barn loft, staring at the cracked steering knuckle wrapped in the rag on the workbench below. The voicemail replayed in my head. Don't let them scrap the machine until someone who knows what they're doing looks at the steering knuckle. David had known. He had tried to warn someone and he had been dismissed. What I needed to find out was how many other people had been dismissed too. The next morning I drove into town. Wheatland wasn't much. A main street with a diner, a hardware store, a church, and the county library where the old microfiche machine still worked. I spent 3 hours scrolling through back issues of the Wheatland Gazette, looking for anything related to farm accidents involving Massey Ferguson tractors from that era. What I found stopped my breath. In the span of 6 years, there had been 4 separate reports of rollovers involving the same model tractor in the surrounding counties. 2 of them had been fatal. In every case, the official cause was listed as operator error or unstable ground. Not one of them mentioned a mechanical inspection. I wrote down the names of the families. The first on the list was a widow named Ruth Hanley who lived just over the county line. I called her from the library parking lot. She agreed to meet me that afternoon. When I pulled up to her property, I saw a farm even more rundown than Kate, with a for sale sign nailed to the fence. Ruth was in her 60s, thin and worn, with hands that looked strong but tired. She invited me into a kitchen that smelled of old coffee and damp wood. I set the cracked knuckle on her table and started to explain, but she cut me off by lifting a photograph from the counter. It showed a man standing beside the same model of tractor, a wide smile under a dusty cap. "My husband, Roy," she said, "died 6 years ago this November. The tractor flipped on flat ground. Flat ground. They said he must have been speeding. Roy never sped a day in his life." Her voice shook but held. She pulled a folder from a drawer. Inside were letters from Evergreen Farm Equipment, the largest Massey dealer in the region, offering a settlement if she agreed not to pursue further investigation. She had signed it because she had no money for a lawyer and 2 grandchildren to raise. The settlement was for $12,000, barely enough to bury him. I asked if I could take photos of the documents. She nodded. "They told me I was lucky they offered anything," she said. "Most families get nothing because the county reports always blame the driver, but Roy told me the week before he died that the tractor had been pulling strange. He took it to Evergreen and they said they adjusted the linkage. No paperwork, no record. That was when the pattern clicked into place. Every victim had reported a steering issue to the same dealership before their death. And every time, the dealership had either dismissed the concern or made an undocumented repair that was never entered into any system. I drove back to Kate's farm that evening with a fire burning in my chest. I found her in the garden, weeding the tomato rows with Macy and June on either side of her. When I told her what I'd found, she didn't look surprised. She looked like someone finally seeing the shape of a monster they had only glimpsed in shadows. "David took the tractor to Evergreen 3 times," she said. "They kept telling him it was normal wear, but he knew tractors. He grew up on one. He said the steering felt like it had a mind of its own." June looked up from her weeding, her small face serious. "Daddy said the tractor was sick and the doctors wouldn't listen." Macy added, "The bad men lied, didn't they?" I knelt down to their level. "Yes," I said, "and now we're going to prove it." The next day I called Evergreen Farm Equipment and asked to speak with the owner. His name was Harlan Croft. He had a voice like gravel wrapped in false charm. I told him I was a mechanic and had questions about a tractor I was restoring. He agreed to meet me at the dealership the following afternoon. Kate wanted to come, but I told her to stay with the girls. Something told me this conversation would go sideways, and I didn't want them anywhere near it. The dealership sat on the edge of town, a sprawling lot full of shiny new tractors with 0% financing banners and a repair bay in the back. Harlan Croft was a big man in his late 50s with a gut that tested the buttons on his polo shirt. He smiled when I walked in, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. I didn't waste time. I set the steering knuckle on his counter and said, "I'm here about the defect you covered up." The smile vanished. His face went red, then pale. He looked around the showroom to make sure no customers were within earshot and lowered his voice. "I don't know what you're talking about. That part is from a 40-year-old tractor. Parts break." I told him I had service records showing David Keller brought his tractor in 3 times complaining about steering pull, and each time your shop made adjustments without documenting a root cause. I told him I had found 3 other families with the same story. His eyes flickered. He knew. He absolutely knew. He grabbed my arm and pulled me into a back office, slamming the door. "Listen to me, you nobody mechanic. David Keller was a reckless operator, that's the official finding. You keep digging into things that aren't your concern and you'll find yourself in a world of trouble. Slander, lawsuits, criminal trespass. You think a widow wants to relive all that in court?" His grip tightened, and I could feel the threat in his fingers. I pulled free and stared him down. "I'm not the one who should be scared of court," I said. "David left a voicemail predicting his own death. He named the steering knuckle, a part that your dealership repeatedly failed to inspect properly. That's not slander, that's evidence." Harlan Croft laughed, but it was hollow. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick file. He didn't show me the contents, but he tapped it with his finger. "I have signed settlement agreements from every family you mentioned. Confidentiality clauses. They can't talk about what they signed, and if they do, they have to pay back every cent plus penalties. You want to help these people. Walk away before you make their lives worse." I left the dealership with my hands shaking. Driving back, I realized the full scope of the cover-up. The dealership hadn't just ignored the defect. They had used the county's accident reports to shift blame onto the dead and then leveraged legal contracts to buy silence from the survivors. It was a machine designed to protect profit at the cost of human life. When I got back to the farm, Kate was waiting on the porch. She took one look at my face and knew. I told her everything. She sat down on the steps and stared at the dirt. "They're going to try to take the farm now, aren't they?" she said. I asked her what she meant. She explained that the farm still carried a loan from the bank, and Harlan Croft sat on the bank's board of directors. He had influence over loan renewals. The moment we started making noise, he would call in favors. Sure enough, 3 days later, a certified letter arrived from First Wheatland Bank. The loan was being called due to irregularities in the collateral assessment. The balance was $247,000, payable in full within 90 days. Kate read the letter in the kitchen, her hands trembling, while the girls ate cereal at the table. "He's going to take this place," she whispered. "It's been in David's family for 4 generations. We have nowhere else to go." I took the letter from her and set it aside. "He can try," I said, "but he just made the biggest mistake of his career." I explained that the loan recall was retaliation, which is illegal. It proved we were a threat. It proved he knew the truth would destroy him. Kate looked at me, and for the first time in 3 years I saw something ignite behind her eyes. It wasn't hope exactly. It was fight. That week I worked double shifts, fixing the tractor by day, building our case by night. I called Ruth Hanley again, and she agreed to get a copy of her settlement from her old lawyer. I contacted the other families. One, a woman named Teresa Morales, had refused to sign the settlement. Her husband had died in a rollover identical to David's 2 years prior. She had recorded phone calls with Evergreen Farm Equipment where they admitted the steering issue but blamed her husband's excessive speed. She still had those recordings. She was angry and ready to talk. But here's the thing about small towns. Word travels fast. The day after I spoke to Teresa, I came back to the barn to find the workbench cleared. The cracked steering knuckle was gone. The rag it was wrapped in lay on the floor, but the piece itself had vanished. I searched the barn, checked the doors, found no sign of forced entry. Someone had walked in while I was out and taken the single most critical piece of physical evidence. Kate saw my face and went white. "They were here," she said. "While I was in the garden with the girls, I didn't hear anything." June, sitting on the sofa, looked up and said quietly, "The man in the black car came. He looked in the barn, then he drove away fast." She didn't sound scared. She sounded like a child who already understood too much about the cruelty of adults. I called the sheriff's office to report the theft. A deputy came out, took notes, expressed skepticism. He asked if maybe I'd misplaced the part myself. I knew then that Harlan Croft's reach extended into law enforcement. We were on our own. That night after the girls were asleep, Kate and I sat in the living room with the lights low. She looked at me with a depth of trust that frightened me because I knew I was now the only thing standing between her family and complete ruin. I told her about the plan forming in my mind. Teresa's recordings, Ruth's settlement documents, the voicemail from David. We didn't need the physical knuckle anymore. We had a paper trail and audio. What we needed was someone with the power to force a real investigation, someone outside the county's influence. Kate said, barely above a whisper, "If we do this, they'll destroy you too. Harlan won't stop until he's buried us all." I reached over and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but she held on. "I've been drifting for 10 years, Kate," I said, "fixing engines and moving on. For the first time in my life, I've found something worth fighting for. I'm not leaving, no matter what comes." She didn't say anything. She just leaned into my shoulder and let the silence hold us. Outside, the wind moved through the wheat, and for a moment the farm felt like a fortress instead of a target. But I knew the storm was only beginning, because the next morning I would discover that David Keller hadn't just left a voicemail. He had filed a formal complaint with the National Transportation Safety Board 6 days before his death, and that complaint had been buried so deep that unearthing it would blow the cover-up wide open and put everything we loved directly in the crosshairs. The discovery came from the last place I expected. I had spent the night combing through online databases for any federal safety complaints related to the tractor model, but the NTSB's public portal showed nothing. It was like the machine never existed. But the next morning, Teresa Morales called me. She had been going through her husband's old files and found a confirmation letter from the NTSB acknowledging receipt of a complaint from one David Keller with a case number. She read the number over the phone, 2018-0432. My hands shook as I wrote it down. I called the NTSB's Public Records Office and gave them the number. The woman on the line went silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Sir, that case file is restricted. I can't access it." I asked why a routine agricultural safety complaint would be restricted. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "The restriction was placed by the Office of the Secretary. I'm not authorized to discuss it further." The Office of the Secretary. That meant someone at the federal level had buried David Keller's complaint before he was even in the ground. The tractor defect wasn't just a local dealership cover-up. It reached into Washington. I told Kate. She sat down at the kitchen table, her face pale. Why would anyone at that level care about a tractor accident in a nowhere county? I didn't have an answer yet, but I was going to find out. I called a journalist I knew from my drifting days, a man named Ellis Quinn. He worked for an independent investigative outlet and had a reputation for chasing corporate corruption. He listened to my story for 40 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, he said quietly, "You just opened a door that a lot of powerful people have been trying to keep sealed. How fast can you get me those documents?" I scanned and sent everything. The voicemail recording, Ruth's settlement agreement, Teresa's complaint confirmation letter, photos of the cracked knuckle before it was stolen, and a sworn statement from Kate detailing every interaction David had with Evergreen Farm Equipment. Ellis called back within 3 hours. His voice was tighter now, urgent. "Matthew, I ran a search on that NTSB case number through a source I have. That complaint was not an isolated incident. It was one of 27 filed over a 5-year period, all involving the same defect in the steering knuckle of that specific Massey Ferguson model. 23 of them resulted in fatal rollovers. 4 resulted in permanent disability. The NTSB opened an investigation in late 2018 but closed it 3 months later, citing insufficient evidence. The lead investigator retired abruptly. His name was Gerald Voss. I closed my eyes. 27 families, 27 warnings ignored. And then I remembered something. The old neighbor, Walter Green, who had written the letter to the paper questioning David's death. He had died of a stroke 8 months later. I asked Ellis to check if any of the other families had experienced similar intimidation or unusual deaths. He said he'd get back to me. That afternoon, the bank sent a second letter. It was no longer just calling the loan due. It was demanding immediate possession of the farm within 30 days, citing a clause in the original mortgage agreement that allowed acceleration if the property was found to be in waste or disrepair. They sent an inspector who had visited the farm the day before, while we were out, and photographed peeling paint on the barn and some fallen fence posts. Kate had been maintaining the place as best she could, but 3 years of grief had taken a toll, and now they were weaponizing that against her. I went to the bank in person with Kate, holding the photographs of the defect and the voicemail transcript. The branch manager, a man named Lowell Finch, wouldn't even look at them. He just repeated the bank's position. The loan was in default, the property was scheduled for auction. I asked if Harlan Croft had pressured him. Lowell's face flickered and he said, "I have no further comment." Outside, on the sidewalk, Kate leaned against the building and took deep, shaking breaths. "He's going to take everything," she whispered. "My children's home, David's legacy, and I can't stop it." I took her shoulders gently. "You're not alone. And he's made one critical mistake. He's overplaying his hand." I didn't tell her yet, but I was already working on my own plan. I had called Gerald Voss's old office line and left a message. I had sent Ellis the bank letters. And I had one more card to play: David's original purchase contract for the tractor, which Kate had found in a box in the attic. It included a warranty clause that explicitly stated Massey Ferguson guaranteed the tractor's components against manufacturing defects for life, a lifetime warranty that the dealership had conveniently ignored. The next week, Ellis's story broke. The headline read, "Federal Cover-Up: How a Tractor Defect Killed 23 Farmers and the NTSB Looked Away." It included interviews with Ruth Hanley, Teresa Morales, and Kate. It quoted the voicemail. It published the case number and detailed the buried complaint. The story went viral within hours. National news picked it up. Congressmen from an agricultural state demanded a hearing. And Harlan Croft, who had been untouchable for decades, suddenly had reporters camped on his dealership lot. But that's when things escalated dangerously. 2 nights after the story ran, I was working late in the barn when I heard tires on gravel. I looked out and saw a dark SUV with no plates parked near the house. My heart seized. I grabbed a crowbar and ran toward the kitchen door. Before I could reach it, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man in a plain jacket, 50s, with a military bearing. He held up a badge. "Special Agent Marcus DeWitt, Department of Justice. I need you to come with me." I demanded to know why. He said, "You're in possession of classified material related to an ongoing federal investigation. The NTSB complaint you uncovered is part of a larger probe into corruption within the Department of Agriculture. We've been watching you, Matthew, and we believe you and your family are in imminent danger." He explained that the buried complaint wasn't just about tractors. It was part of a scheme where Massey Ferguson executives had bribed NTSB officials and even some county sheriffs to suppress defect reports across the country. Gerald Voss had been forced into retirement after refusing to sign off on the whitewash. The stolen steering knuckle from the barn had been taken by a corporate fixer who now had evidence of our activities. And Harlan Croft was not merely a dealership owner. He was the regional coordinator for the cover-up, with ties to organized figures who handled problem people. Kate came to the door. The girls huddled behind her. Agent DeWitt glanced at them and softened his tone. "Ma'am, we need to relocate you and your children to a safe location tonight. We have credible intelligence that a man named Harlan Croft has contracted individuals to silence the mechanic and anyone cooperating with him. We've intercepted communications planning to stage a break-in and make it look like an accident." Kate's hand flew to her mouth. June stepped forward, her small voice steady. "The bad man is going to try to hurt us." DeWitt knelt. "No, sweetheart, not if we move fast." I made a decision right there. I trusted my instincts, and this agent's fear matched my own. We packed nothing but the essentials, including the evidence file, and followed DeWitt's unmarked vehicle to a safe house an hour away. It was a nondescript ranch home deep in the woods, guarded by 2 other agents. For the next 72 hours, we were cut off from the farm, from the bank, from Croft. But we were not idle. Ellis Quinn, who had been tipped off by his source about our evacuation, continued publishing. His next story revealed the bribery trail. Internal documents from Massey Ferguson showing that the company had known about the steering knuckle defect as early as 1981, 2 years before David's tractor was even built. They had calculated the cost of a recall versus the cost of settling lawsuits and chose to pay off victims quietly. The NTSB complaint was buried under a national security designation because the tractor model had also been sold to military bases for agricultural use, and a defect acknowledgement would have triggered a massive defense contract audit. The cover-up went all the way to the Pentagon. The "it gets worse" moment came when Agent DeWitt sat us down and revealed that Gerald Voss had been found dead in his apartment 3 years ago, ruled a heart attack, but the coroner's report showed evidence of a toxin that had been overlooked. He had been murdered for refusing to stay silent. And now that the story was out, Harlan Croft was desperate enough to have gone into hiding, but his network was still operational. The fixer who stole the knuckle had been tracked to a motel near the state line with a file full of surveillance photos of us, including pictures of the girls playing in the yard. The threat was not abstract. It was immediate and personal, but out of darkness came the turning point. The congressional hearing was fast-tracked. Kate was called to testify. So was I, so were Ruth and Teresa and 4 other widows. The hearing would be public, televised, and would force the release of the full NTSB complaint file. It was scheduled for 3 weeks later in Washington. Our safe house became a war room. DeWitt's team worked with Ellis to locate all the surviving families and prepare testimony. Ruth, who had been quiet for years, agreed to speak about her settlement and the pressure she'd faced. Teresa provided her recordings, which were authenticated. And Kate found, in a hidden compartment of David's old desk, a handwritten journal where he had documented every phone call with Evergreen, every time he was dismissed, and even a note about his NTSB complaint. The journal was dated the morning of the accident. He had written, "If I die today, it's because the tractor was never fixed. Show this to the world." That journal, combined with the voicemail, was the emotional anchor that would break the case open. But Harlan Croft was not going down without a fight. On the eve of the hearing, we received word that the bank had foreclosed on the farm and sold it to a shell company controlled by Croft's associates. The auction had been held secretly, with no public notice. Kate's childhood home, where her husband had proposed, where her daughters had taken their first steps, was gone. I held her as she wept, but I could feel her grief hardening into resolve. The next morning at the airport, as we prepared to fly to Washington, a man in a suit approached me as I stood by the gate with Kate and the girls. He handed me a thick envelope. "From a friend who believes in justice," he said, and vanished. Inside were complete internal memos from Massey Ferguson, stamped confidential, detailing the defect, the decision to bury it, and the names of every corporate executive who signed off. The source: a whistleblower inside the company's legal department who had been waiting for the right moment. The file included a list of all 27 victims, with notes on how their cases were suppressed. David Keller's name was on that list, circled in red. I stared at the papers, then at Kate. She read them, then looked up at me with fierce determination. "We're going to make sure every single name is spoken aloud in that hearing room, and we're going to get that farm back." June and Macy, holding hands, nodded solemnly. It was no longer just about survival. It was about justice, about David, about every farmer who had been told their death was their own fault. The plane lifted off, and as we climbed above the clouds, I felt the weight of the truth in my hands. The final battle was about to begin. The hearing room in Washington was smaller than I expected. Just a long wooden table on a raised platform, a row of chairs for witnesses, and a panel of stern-faced congressmen who had probably never sat behind the wheel of a tractor in their lives. But the cameras were everywhere. Every major news outlet had a feed running live. I sat in the front row of the audience section, Kate beside me, her hand gripping mine so hard my knuckles ached. Behind us, Ruth Hanley and Teresa Morales and 4 other widows I'd never met before but who now felt like family. They had come from Nebraska, from Iowa, from Kansas, each carrying a manila envelope of pain. The chairman gavelled the session open, and spoke the words we had waited months to hear. This committee will now hear testimony regarding the cover-up of a known manufacturing defect in Massey Ferguson tractors and the subsequent deaths of 27 American farmers. Kate was called first. She walked to the witness table in her simple blue dress, the same dress she'd worn to her husband's funeral. The room fell silent. She raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth, and then leaned into the microphone. Her voice was quiet, but it filled every speaker in the room. She told them about David's 3 visits to the dealership, about his growing fear, about the phone call where they dismissed him as a nervous operator. Then she held up her phone and played the voicemail. David's voice echoed through the chamber. "If something goes wrong, it's not your fault. And don't let them scrap the machine until someone who knows what they're doing looks at the steering knuckle. Promise me." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. One of the congresswomen covered her mouth. A staffer in the back turned away. When the voicemail ended, Kate said, "He kept that promise for me, and now I'm keeping it for him." She placed David's handwritten journal on the table, the entry from the morning of his death clearly marked and enlarged on the screens. The chairman asked her to read it. She did, her voice steady. "If I die today, it's because the tractor was never fixed. Show this to the world." The corporate lawyers sitting in the back shifted uncomfortably. They knew what was coming. Then it was my turn. I walked up with a cardboard box containing the documents the whistleblower had given me at the airport. I described finding the hairline crack in the steering knuckle, how it had been a manufacturing defect cast into the metal, invisible to the naked eye but catastrophic under stress. I showed photographs of the part before it was stolen. I told them about Ruth Hanley's settlement, about the confidentiality clauses that bought silence for $12,000 a life. I played Teresa's recorded phone calls where the dealership acknowledged the steering issue but blamed operator error. And then I opened the whistleblower's files and read aloud from the internal Massey Ferguson memos. Recommendation: do not issue recall. Cost estimate for full retrofit of affected models exceeds $43 million. Anticipated litigation settlements from known failure projections total under $2 million. Continue with current customer relations protocol. The man who signed that memo, a senior vice president named Leland Bryce, was sitting in the back row behind his legal team. His face was the color of old ash. Ruth testified next, her voice cracking as she described signing the settlement while her grandchildren cried in the next room. Teresa played the recording where an Evergreen manager told her, "Your husband was speeding. The tractor's fine." The other widows followed, each story a variation on the same devastating theme. A farmer who knew something was wrong, a dealership that ignored him, a death blamed on the victim, and a family left with nothing but guilt. Then came the surprise witness that even I hadn't anticipated. A woman named Dr. Angela Cross, a former engineer at Massey Ferguson who had worked on the steering assembly design team in the late 70s. She had retired years ago but had seen the news coverage and reached out to the committee the night before. She testified that the defect was identified during pre-production testing in 1980. The engineering team flagged it, recommended a stronger alloy for the knuckle, but management overruled them because the cheaper metal saved $47 per tractor. $47. Multiplied by the 42,000 units produced, that was under $2 million in savings. And it had cost 27 lives. The room erupted. The chairman had to bang his gavel repeatedly. Leland Bryce's lawyer leaned over and whispered something, and Bryce's expression shifted from fear to resignation. The hearing lasted 3 days. When it concluded, the committee issued a preliminary finding of gross negligence, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Criminal referrals were made to the Department of Justice for 17 executives and 4 federal officials who had buried the NTSB investigation. The Department of Agriculture announced an immediate review of all pending defect complaints. The NTSB reopened its case and issued a formal apology to every family in the room. But the moment that mattered most to me happened outside the hearing, on the marble steps of the Capitol building, with cameras still rolling. A reporter asked Kate how she felt now that the truth was out. Kate turned and looked at me, then back at the microphone. "I feel like my husband can finally rest," she said, "and I feel like I can finally start living again." And then, right there in front of the world, she smiled. Not a guarded half smile, but a real one, the kind that crinkles the corners of your eyes and makes you believe the worst might actually be behind you. The flight home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one that had hung over the farm when I first arrived. Kate slept with her head on my shoulder. Across the aisle, Macy and June colored in a book Deputy DeWitt had given them. June looked up at one point and whispered to her sister, "See, I told you he'd fix it." Macy nodded solemnly, then added, "And now we get to keep him." Back in Wheatland, the legal fallout undid everything Croft had done. The DOJ investigation revealed that the foreclosure on Kate's farm had been illegally accelerated as retaliation, orchestrated by Harlan Croft in coordination with the bank manager. A federal judge voided the sale and returned the deed to Kate within 48 hours. Croft himself was arrested at a private airfield, trying to flee the country with a bag of cash and a fake passport. The dealership was seized, its assets frozen, and a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of all affected families. The settlement, when it came months later, wouldn't bring anyone back, but it ensured that every widow who had been silenced would never want for money again. The farm was ours again, and I say ours because somewhere between the hearing and the homecoming, I had stopped being just the mechanic. I remember walking into the barn that first evening back. The stolen steering knuckle had been recovered from the fixer's motel room and was now in an evidence locker, but in its place, something else waited. Agent DeWitt had left a package on the workbench. Inside was a framed letter from the NTSB officially acknowledging David Keller's complaint and thanking him posthumously for his courage. I hung it on the barn wall next to a photo of David standing beside that same tractor, back when it was still shiny and new. That night, we had dinner around the kitchen table, all five of us. Kate, the girls, Sebastian, the neighbor who had kept the place from falling apart while we were gone, and me. The meal was simple: roast chicken, garden vegetables, fresh bread, but it tasted like everything I'd been missing in 10 years of drifting. Afterward, while the girls played in the living room, Kate pulled me aside on the porch. The sunset painted the wheat field in shades of orange and pink. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she took my hand and said, "I was afraid to feel this again. I thought loving someone new would mean forgetting David, but you helped me remember him. You helped me clear his name, and you gave me back my smile." She paused, her eyes bright. "I don't want you to leave, ever." I told her I wasn't going anywhere, that I had spent a decade fixing engines because I was too broken to fix anything else, but somewhere in the grease and the grief, I had found a family that needed me to stay. She kissed me then, and it was nothing like the careful distance I'd kept in every other town. It felt like coming home. Now, here's the thing I haven't told you yet, the detail that still sends a chill down my spine when I think about it. On the plane back from Washington, while Kate slept, I was organizing the evidence files for the attorneys. I opened the whistleblower's folder to check a page number, and a small photograph slipped out from between the papers. It was old, faded, taken at a farming convention in 1983. A group of men in flannel shirts and seed caps stood in front of a Massey Ferguson display tractor. One of the men was my father. He died when I was 12 in a rollover accident in our own field. They said he hit a ditch. They said it was his fault. I never saw the tractor afterward. My mother sold it to pay the funeral costs. I stared at that photograph for 10 minutes, my heart pounding. My father had been at that convention. He had likely spoken to the very executives who knew about the defect. And he had died on the same model tractor, with the same steering failure, 5 years before David Keller ever climbed into his seat. The cover-up hadn't just killed 27 farmers I'd never met. It had killed my own father. And I had spent my entire life not knowing, carrying an orphan's guilt, while the company that built the machine continued to sell it to unsuspecting families. I never told Kate that night. Some truths need time to settle. But as I stood on the porch with her under the fatting sun, I understood that my entire drifting journey, every farm I'd stopped at, every engine I'd fixed, every lonely road I'd taken had been leading me to this place, to this family, to a tractor that had been waiting for someone who could see the flaw that others had ignored. The twins had been right from the very first day. They had whispered that I was going to make their mama smile again. What they couldn't have known was that in doing so, I would finally find a reason to smile myself. And somewhere, I believe David and my father are both at peace, knowing the truth has finally been told. I've been asked many times since then whether I believe in fate. I'm a mechanic. I believe in torque specs and metal fatigue and the cold logic of why things fail. But the more I look back, the more I have to admit that some things do seem to find us for a reason. I drove into that farm to fix iron, and I unearthed a truth that had been buried beneath 30 years of lies. A truth that didn't just free Kate and the girls, it freed me too. The defect that killed 27 farmers didn't start with David. It started in a boardroom where executives decided that a human life was worth $47. That math is terrifying not because it's complicated, but because it's simple. It's the kind of arithmetic that happens in closed meetings all the time, in industries you trust every day. The tractor that took my father's life rolled out of the same factory with the same flawed part, and for decades I blamed the wrong person. So did Kate. So did Ruth. So did every widow who signed a settlement they never understood. But here's the thing about truth. It only stays buried if no one digs. I almost didn't. I almost shrugged, fixed the engine, collected my pay, and moved on to the next dying farm. If I had, Kate would have lost her home, the girls would have carried their father's death as an unsolved grief, and the cover-up would still be intact. It took 2 6-year-olds whispering in a barn to stop me in my tracks. They saw something in me that I hadn't seen in myself in years, the capacity to care enough to stay. So the broader question is this: what hidden flaw are you living with right now? Maybe not in a machine, but in a story someone told you about yourself or about someone you loved. Maybe it's time to look closer, to trust the quiet instinct that says something doesn't add up. Because the people who hold power rely on exhaustion, on shame, on the hope that no one will ever bother to examine the evidence too carefully. They count on you to walk away. We didn't walk away. Kate and the girls gave me a home, a purpose, and a family I never thought I'd have. I gave them back the truth about David, and with it, the smile they'd lost. That's more than a trade. That's a story of what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept the official line. If you took something from this journey, a little more courage, a little more suspicion of the convenient narrative, then this story has done its work. I'm still here on Kate's farm, spinning wrenches, planting tomatoes, and listening to June and Macy plan their future inventions. The world hasn't stopped being messy, but at least now I know where I belong. Thanks for riding along with me. If you want to hear more stories that dig past the surface and find the truth that's waiting to be uncovered, hit subscribe and come back. There are a lot of rusted machines out there, and a lot of hidden reasons why they broke. Until next time, keep your eyes open, and never underestimate what a pair of 6-year-olds might whisper to the right stranger.